Yeah, we have a huge advantage over the well-funded people. I'm still waiting for my first big oil paycheck, but I have something more valuable in that I'm actually telling the truth, which gives us a huge leg up over the competition in this debate. The title of my talk is The Emperor's... this is going to be hard to do without slides. But the title of my talk is The Emperor's New Climate, which is, of course, named after Hans Christian Andersen's 19th century story, The Emperor's New Clothes, which was a tremendous story of groupthink. Everybody, including the king, was bought off on a bunch of nonsense because they believed that everyone else believed that same nonsense. Oh, there it is. Good. Everybody believed. They bought off on the belief that everyone else believed the same nonsense, and nobody wanted to appear ignorant. So they all went along with something which they absolutely didn't believe, and obviously wasn't true. Next, please. And in fact, more than 97% of all of the experts agreed that the emperor was wearing fine clothing at the time. In fact, I believe it was actually 100% was the correct statistic. Next, please. I'm going to go through these pretty rapidly. I've got a huge amount of material to cover and not a lot of time, so I apologize in advance. I'm going to do this very fast. But this is probably the best newspaper article about climate change I've ever seen. It's from 1871. It was originally written in the Pall Mall Gazette, entitled "Imaginary Changes of Climate." And there's a few key passages in there. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists. And then, every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month, one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to... Oh, sorry. Sorry, I can't, the problem is I can't read. And much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate. Can't read it, but it tends in some minds to rather produce a tendency to exaggerate it. And that's exactly what we see going on now. We see a tremendous amount of records available, but the information that's being passed out actually doesn't bear a very close resemblance to what's being measured. And the way I'm going to show you how I present my message is by presenting my message here, basically. So next, please. So we're all familiar with these graphs. These are basically the graphs which shape people's perception of climate change. On the left is the temperature graph from the 2001 IPCC report, and on the right is the current GIST, NASA global temperature graph, showing a strong warming over the last century, particularly. Next, please. But they weren't always like this. In the 1990 IPCC report, on the left, you can see it was very different. They had a strong medieval warm period, a strong little ice age, and most importantly, note that the 20th century was nothing remarkable at all. It was very close to the median and basically flat for the last 40 years or so. And on the right, we have the 2001 version of the same graph where we have a very sharp spike at the end. Next, please. And this graph overlays the two. It overlays the 2001 version on the 1990 version. You can see what's been done. The middle warm period's gone, the little ice age is gone, and there's a sharp spike at the end which didn't exist in the 1990 graph. So it's amazing how the past changed over a period of 11 years. Next. Okay, now, but it wasn't always like this. The graph on the left is from a 1975 National Academy of Sciences report for the Northern Hemisphere. And the key thing to note here is that 1970 was no warmer than 1910, and in fact was actually colder than 1900. And the graph on the right is from 1974 from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and once again we see the same thing, that 1970 was no warmer than 1910. And these are really important things to keep in your mind as I go on. Next, please. Okay, now compare the 1975 National Academy of Sciences graph with the current NASA graph. We've gone from no warming from 1910 to 1970, and now we have 0.4 C warming. So the past has magically changed since 1975. Somehow the people who are alive now are believe they're more familiar with what temperatures were back then when the people who actually were adults at that time. Next, please. So which graph is correct? The one which shows no warming from 1910 to 1970, or the one which shows a lot of warming? So the article on the left is from 1910, from the newspaper in 1910. It basically says that almost all of the world's glaciers were melting in 1910. And this is interesting because in the NASA graph, 1910 was one of the coldest years on record, yet all of the glaciers were melting. And these are people who observed it at the time. And by 1922, this is a famous report which was in the Weather Bureau report about how many glaciers had actually disappeared in the Arctic at that point. They'd been very warm, and there'd been a tremendous amount of melting going on between 1910 and 1922. Next, please. By 1940, scientists reported that 1/3 of the Arctic ice had disappeared, and that Greenland's glaciers were melting so fast that they were actually nearing a catastrophe. So we know that it must have been very warm at that time, based on observations, and these were famous scientists. Hans Alman was from Caltech. Next, please. By 1950, the glaciers of Norway and Alaska were reported to have lost half their mass since the beginning of the century. And this is very important because a lot of times people claim that this warming, which occurred in 1940, was just in the eastern Arctic, but we actually can see that Alaska must have been very warm because their glaciers lost half their mass during that period. Could you imagine if glaciers lost half their mass at current time? It would be, people would be screaming bloody murder. Okay, next, please. By 1958, the Arctic melting was so bad that the New York Times predicted that their children would be sailing across the North Pole. They predicted an ice-free Arctic. Next, please. But then things changed very dramatically. By 1960s, it became apparent that the world was cooling very quickly. And if you look at the article on the left, it was from the New York Times. It said there was a unanimous consensus of scientists that the world was cooling in 1961. So this isn't some flaky thing which Connolly can go and change. I mean, this was a unanimous consensus. And the article on the right's interesting because glaciers in Norway were growing for the first time in 200 years in the 1960s. So we know it was a cold period. Next, please. By 1969, the New York Times was reporting that scientists were worried about a new ice age. Next, please. By 1971, NASA's top climatologists were predicting a new ice age by as early as the year 2020, 6 years from now. Next, please. By 1972, Britain's top climate scientist, the head of Climatic Research Unit, predicted a new ice age. Next, please. By 1974, Stephen Schneider, very famous American climate scientist, was very frustrated. He was trying to warn Nixon about global cooling and how it was going to wreck the United States, and Nixon wouldn't listen to him. I think Nixon had more important things to worry about in 1974, actually. Okay, next, please. Okay, and this article is very important. Unfortunately, I can't read it from this angle. But there's a few key things to note. One is that Arctic ice had gained 12% by the early 1970s. But the really interesting stuff, there's some stuff in the middle there which I can't read, but it's basically meteorologists saying that climatologists don't know what they're talking about, which I think is probably a familiar theme. Next, please. Okay, so now, according to the NASA graph and what I've just showed you, apparently the freezing point of water has changed. We had glaciers melting very rapidly in 1920 when it was cold, and we had the Arctic freezing up very rapidly in 1970 when it was 0.4 C warmer. So this looks a little dodgy. Okay, next, please. Now compare that to the 1975 National Academy of Sciences graph. Note that this graph makes sense. Glaciers were melting when it was warm and ice was forming when it was cold. That's normally how physical law works. Okay, next, please. And this next graph shows how the Northern Hemisphere temperatures have changed since the 1975 National Academy of Sciences report. What they've basically done is removed the 1940s blip, and all temperatures before 1960 have been cooled rather remarkably. So remember that about the 40s blip being removed. Next slide, please. Now, this is my favorite ClimateGate email from Tom Wigley to Phil Jones. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we were still left with why the blip. So they actually wanted to remove the blip. They didn't even know why it was there. And they did remove it. It's gone now. Next, please. And this graph shows the changes between the 1975 graph and the current GIST graph. And you can see that there's been nearly 0.5 C removed from temperatures from 1910 to 1940. Next, please. And a lot of these changes were done in the Arctic. The GIST version 2 showed Iceland was very warm around 1940. In GIST version 3, they eliminated that warmth. It just disappeared. And it's not just Reykjavik, it's other cities in Iceland and some cities in Greenland had the same thing. Next, please. But the 1940s blip was real. Remembering back to this 1940 article, it reported that it would not be exaggerating to say that the glaciers of Greenland were nearing a catastrophe. This was real. It was really warm there. They can't rewrite the past like that. Next, please. And it wasn't just the northern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere showed the same thing. The 1990 IPCC report showed the southern hemisphere cooling from 1950s to the 1970s, and the current GIST graph shows it's warming. Next, please. So basically, by picking the right set of global stations, you can generate any shaped graph you want. I've done some work with the global temperature record. There's a huge selection of stations to choose from. If you just randomly pick among that group, do it 10 different times with 10 different random numbers, you'll get 10 completely different results. Next, please. Yeah, but the much more reliable record is the United States temperature record. We've had a very good continuous set of records for a long time. And exactly the same thing's been done in the United States. The graph on the left is the 1999 NASA US temperature graph. They showed that the 1930s were very warm, much warmer than the 1990s. And the graph on the right is the current version of the same graph. And once again, the 1930s have been made cold, and the 1990s were made much warmer. 1934, it used to be the hottest year in U.S. history, and now 1998 is the hottest year. As of 1999, it was half a degree centigrade cooler than 1934. So I think I actually have a lot more to do, material to cover, but unfortunately I'm out of time. So I think this will probably be a good place to leave it here. Okay, thank you.